New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, and American Illustrator. His work is imaginative, innovative, clever, and fun. I'm sure you all know it well. I am a fan too. And tonight he will be in conversation with the artist, designer Francoise Mouly. Mouly, for the last 19 years, has served as the art director of the New Yorker magazine. She's also known for her work with Raw, a cutting-edge comic art publication that she designed and co-edited with Art Speigelman. She has also begun a publishing wing of Raw, Raw one-shots, then a junior division, Little Lit, and in 2008, Toon Books. Her most recent book is Blown Covers. I think the title says it all. And Christoph actually did the end papers for the book and has some covers in it. Christoph and Francoise will talk for about 45 minutes this evening. Then we'll open it up to the floor for questions for about 10 minutes. Then they both will sign their books behind me at the table. Please join me in welcoming Christoph Niemann and Francoise Mouly.
All right.
Good evening.
Good evening. Before we start, obviously we have to log in. So I need your password, please. Your mother's maiden name. I need the name of your first pet and of your mother's maiden's pet. 26 licorice drops. What's the first line of America the Beautiful? No, that's actually the Star Spangled Banner. Anyhow, I think your first pet just ate all the licorice. Uh-oh, seems like your pet is licorice intolerant. One of his eyes seems bigger. What's the number of your first pet's vet? Never mind. How many states in the Union? How many stars in the Big Dipper? Draw a map of Wyoming, including the state capital. Who shot the sheriff? Did you shoot the deputy? How about his pet? So, welcome.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Francoise Mouly. I'm the art editor of The New Yorker, and I have been for the past 19 years. And I've been responsible over that time for over 950 covers for the magazine. And often I'm asked the question, how do you come up with the images to put on the cover of the magazine? And frankly, each one is different. But Christoph has been able to give the answer in one picture. It's basically a lot of trial and error. But the thing about the images on the cover of the magazine is that they have to be able to stand alone. And like other magazines, they're storytelling pictures. They don't illustrate a cover story with the words, sketches to try out for images, such as here. They have to be smart and funny. I have been, as Jessica was saying, interested in pictures and cartoons and comics all of my life, ever since I first came to New York and met the cartoonists who I fell in love with, Art Speigelman, and we did, is there any way to actually shrink the image a little bit? It seems like it's a little bit cut off by the screen. But so the power of images is something that was miraculous for me when I first discovered it, because it cuts through a lot of other things that can be said, and it can be compacted to have layers and layers of meaning. So, for example, on the upper left is the cover of the first issue of Raw, which we put out in 1980 to demonstrate how interesting comics and graphics could be. Then in the bottom left is Raw number 3, and the large image is a cover of the Torn Again Graphics magazine, Raw 7. And when we did that, it was a collage by Art of a composite of a number of things. One was, in the upper left-hand corner, a shredded piece of the third cover, then my eyeball right there, and then we had actually torn a piece of that cover, because at the time magazine distribution was returnable, and anybody who didn't sell the magazine would just send you the shredded logo to get credit on it. So we ended up designing the magazine around the needs of the artist. On the left-hand side was a strip by Joost Zwart about a man who was being torn apart. And on the right-hand side was the contents page for the issue, where we had international artists such as, we had a Japanese section in that issue, and we also ended up gluing, at my request, the corners that we had torn off the front cover back onto the contents page. As a matter of fact, it turned into a kind of sociological experiment, because at the time it had been Art's idea to tear off the corners of the cover he was designing. And then when I was designing the contents page, I said, oh, but let's put things back on it. And when we were at the bindery, where I brought like teams of people to work on the magazine, it turns out that all the guys gravitated toward Art, and they were tearing off corners, and all the girls were in my corner and were taping them back into the magazine. When I first came to the New Yorker, I recognized that there was a kinship between Row and the New Yorker, in the sense that there were magazines that gave primacy to the artist, and we really were eliciting pictures with a point of view. And those images can be very powerful, because they can shape, as Saul Steinberg said at the time, they can shape the way you think, so that after you've seen an image such as this view of the world from 9th Avenue, it's part of your way of seeing the world. And then you realize how chauvinistic any large city can be. All of those storytelling images use words, can use words, or even letters. Like, for example, in this image by Steinberg on the left, this is a moment that we're in where you're bridging between March and April, and he's actually talking about the weather, but giving you a perfect representation of a day like today. And the cover on the right-hand side, where you have, if there's any way to shrink it even a little more, that'd be great, because then you'll get the full image. You have this very solid I am, which is grounded. Can we reduce it a little bit so we have both? No, it's one or the other. Okay. So this is this I am, which is very stone-like and grounded in the ground, and the I have that is floating in the wind partly, and the I do that's floating in the air. But those images imply a dialogue with the reader, and that's an important part of what Christoph does and what I'm looking for on the cover of the magazine. It's images that need to be read. And read in
one
terms
thing, I
of
just need to say
meaning.
one thing about these images. A lot of my fights that I have with editors, because usually when you do covers, not for the New Yorker, but for other magazines, it's always the image versus the headline. And one of the biggest frustrations for me is that the image always duplicates the headline. So it's like, things are going up, and then draw a guy walking up a ladder. And the amazing thing about the Steinberg is that the type and the image just perfectly complement each other. And that's really, I think, really the solution to a perfect cover, that even when you use type, that they are just like two puzzle pieces that fit perfectly together.
So in talking to another cartoonist, Chris Ware, he was, I think, very well pointing out the difference between art in a museum and the kind of communication arts that I look for the New Yorker, that Christoph does. And you're saying, if you go to a museum and you look at a painting and you don't understand the painting, you think you're an idiot. But if you look at the cover of the New Yorker or at comics or graphic novel and you don't understand what it says, and you think that the cartoonist is an idiot. And that's an important distinction, because all the artists, and certainly Christoph is a perfect example, are artists who want to be in dialogue with their audience. It's 50% of the image is when it is actually looked at and read.
And so I actually remember coming here to the Strand, just like buying old ad annuals and like having like suitcases that weighed like 5 pounds back to Europe, and looking at art. I think I probably bought my first Raw magazine here, and realizing that's exactly what I want to do when I grow up, kind of ish. And you know, like now I have that life. I get up in the morning, get the kids ready, and go to the studio, and then I spend the next 8 hours doing the exact opposite of this. And it's really stunning. Ultimately, our goal is to kind of like be funny and clever and entertaining. But I fear the problem with that is that the process in order to do that involves just like sitting there staring, being actually kind of miserable and pretty grumpy, unfortunately. I don't really think, like, the biggest problem with collaboration is not anything creative. It's just like that when illustrators work, they're in a terrible mood. So, oh yeah, now we actually have to move that thing a little back and forth. Oh yes,
oh,
no, actually,
what a
closer.
smart idea.
Closer,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah. Closer, yeah. Closer.
Excellent. How smart.
Okay, to once and for all solve the question of what does it take to come up with a good idea, it's actually 87% effort. This is the exact math. 7.5% luck, 0.5% talent and divine inspiration, and these days, most importantly, 5% staying off the internet for consecutive 90 minutes. I talked to writers who told me that there's an app that shuts down all the web functions for your computer, and you actually have to restart it, and of course that's like admitting defeat. But a lot of writers in the American Academy in Berlin, like American writers, use that app. I think it's very fascinating. I need Google image search, so I can't do that.
The New Yorker was started in 1925 as a humor magazine for writers and for artists in equal parts. And one of the things that artists do is they look around and they look for inspiration. When Ree Irving made this image back again in 1925, he looked at the Encyclopedia Britannica for reference to mark the stuffed shirt dandies, the monocle dandies that he wanted to use as the butt of his joke. And this is a reference from the Britannica from the Comte d'Orsay, which is a French fashion plate from 1830. So back in 1925, when this image first appeared, it was meant to make fun of people who used a monocle to look at butterflies. And over the years, the ways that readers see that image has changed, and it has almost taken itself at its word. I think it's one of the privileges of the New Yorkers that it keeps giving a voice to the artist, and its only consistent beat over the past 87 years has been to ask artists how they see life in the city, how urban sophisticateds react to what is around them. That's what I discovered when I went to the library when I started. Was a great image from the 30s or 40s, gave me a sense of what made people laugh and how they reacted to things. And I decided that this was a great task to give to contemporary artists, a portrait of our times now. The first image that signals that change at the New Yorker was many years ago when a new editor was brought in, Tina Brown, and she asked contemporary artists to do something, and Art Spiegelman proposed this image of a Hasid kissing a black woman, and that was at the time of like extreme racial tension in Crown Heights between blacks and Jews. And it was a huge controversy for the New Yorker to actually deal with contemporary hot issues of their day. And it was a scandal that was discussed by editors and contributors. Now, many years later, it's actually something that seems to be accepted, and it has to broaden the readership to many more people that are paying attention to what's in the magazines. It's a great mix of fiction. This is an image that was proposed at the time for Eustace Tilley back in '94, and it couldn't run. So it ended up, because there was too much opposition from the people at the time. It ended up running inside. But there's many different interpretations.
Sorry, if you can just like quickly, as an illustrator, when you try to do variations of Tilly, the thing you realize is like he has a crazy long neck. And just like insane body. So like the moment you start doing something with it, like draw a full figure, it's a real problem. So I'm especially grateful for that cover because it really explains the anatomy of this guy.
And there have been many variations over the years. The one on the left here is by our Blackman, and it was our first Eustacia Tilly. The one on the right is actually by a great photographer and Wegman, and it's the only time there was a photo on the cover of the magazine. Because Wegman is a cartoonist at heart, even though this could easily have been done in Photoshop, he went out of his way to set up his dog, and then there's somebody behind the dog that's holding the monocle with a gloved hand, and then there's a suspended photo of the other dog shot as a butterfly. All of this staged in front of his enormous, beautiful old Polaroid machines that he has, where I could have done this in 2 minutes in Photoshop, but no, he had to really make it a real photo. But it's really special for artists these days, for narrative artists, for cartoonists, to have a venue as prominent as the New Yorker, and they can use all those symbols. And this is what Christoph did with our great Eustace Tilly.
For me, like, the thing I love about the New Yorker also, like at the Times, is that New York for me is defined to a large degree by such a huge set of shared experiences. When you live your life here, you know that everybody else, they're in the same subway. You say L train or you say G train, and people know what you're talking about. You talk about like experiences in restaurants, at work, and it's something where I feel it's this like gigantic inside joke that you can play with. And when I started this blog for the Times, I realized that this is really like a treasure of visuals, of little stories that you can play with. And ultimately, it's not even like telling a joke. It's more just like winking at the audience and kind of like having this understanding of like a shared world. And so I did this series of Lego pieces that just reduced New York to its kind of like very essence. And I always loved about Lego the restriction. And it's almost like a three-dimensional pixel drawing. In this case, I celebrate the many cultures of New York. Of course, that's the ultimate New York icon. And then I kind of like went like beyond the New York. I also tried to like search in my life for other stories where I felt like people can relate to that and what I'm obsessed with. And of course, flying. I fly between Europe and New York a lot, and especially the flight from New York to Europe, the red eye is especially stressful. I found that when you have like the armrest in the beginning, it's really decided in the first 2 minutes. When you have it for the flight. Once you give it up, you're never going to get it back. So it's really like you have to be alert in these first few minutes of a flight. I hate it when the pilot says, put your seat back in the upright position. Like, upright from what? It's like, it's barely back a half an inch. So I came up with this chart of like how things are actually bent backwards, and the seat doesn't really like qualify remotely. I try to solve things with that like neck pillow, which of course doesn't help whatsoever, and I've tried multiple times. And then for the New Yorker, it's a similar thing. You know, at some point you know, or at least you think you know the readership, and you can start taking these little visual metaphors from all sorts of places and start mixing them together to come up with new directions. So in this case, Francoise had asked me to do something for, I think it was a fashion special.
It was a Japan issue. And what I love about Christoph's work is that it looks very easy and effortless, but he works so hard at condensing all of his ideas into one picture. So this was his first sketch at the time, Japan Pokemon, that was big. And then when talking to him, he added other elements. So he tried it out with cell phones and with watches, which was a big deal then. And then all of those stylistic elements, one of the things that Christoph has flexibility with is a style of rendering, where like many of the great artists that work for the magazine, first they privilege their idea, and then once they have the idea, then they'll put whatever stylistic skills that they have at the service of the idea. So the final rendering was done as a very classical Japanese image and had all of the ideas that Christoph had, but all condensed, not too many, but just enough to make all the points that could fit on one picture.
So at the beginning, I thought when I did the blog, I had to tell special stories, and I was scanning my life for, you know, like what's special about me. And I had this one thing about like my kids being obsessed about the subway, which is really not that newsworthy. And ultimately, I really realized it's not about that. It's just finding things that I care about and just presenting them differently. I love spooning. Spooning is fantastic. I've been spooning for quite a while. The one thing I haven't figured out is like what to do with that bottom arm, and it's an ongoing struggle. All the parents with small kids will appreciate that. Like the kid shows up at 4 a.m. and then it's queued for exactly a minute and a half. And then they enter what we like to refer to as helicopter mode, like very slowly. They kind of start spinning for like whatever reason. And then at 5:30, all of a sudden you get whacked by a foot in the face. No, but the great thing is, technically I'm a columnist at the time. So it's like me and Tom Friedman and Maureen Dowd, right? So I can really rage about whatever is wrong in the world. And the one thing that I really think should, if I was God, the one thing I would get rid of is dreams. I work really hard during the day. I have a lot of things going on. At night, I just want to rest. I don't want to be bothered with like crazy stories. And to kind of explain that, I came up with this chart here of why I think dreams suck. I kind of divided it up in the different sections, like commuting, you know, driving things that won't stop, and trying to run with your feet being stuck. Back to school, it's a whole chapter, which, yeah, I had a great life in school. Why does it come up in my dreams as like a strange experience? And you see there's like the blue ones are the good ones, and there's very few of them. The worst are pointless. You know, you wake up in the morning after 3 hours all exhausted from a story you can barely remember. So being opinionated, of course, is also a big part of the New Yorker covers.
And we do ask, this is soliciting sketches from many artists about not just what dreams they had last night, but also like all of the trends in the culture and what is happening. Like we have a framework of evergreen images that we can prepare in advance, but when there are things in the news that are worth addressing, if we get a good idea from an artist, then we can also put that on the image. So this is a number of the sketches that didn't run for whatever reason, because there's always, you know, sometimes it's just logistics and sometimes it's just not the right image for us to publish. But one of the things that I'm grateful for is the fact that people like Christoph and all the other artists do not edit, and they put out a lot of narrative and stories and ideas. So here on the right-hand side was an image that was sent at the time by Harry Bliss, at the time when Giuliani was mayor and the Abner Louima and the Amadou Diallo cases were rocking the news, and that didn't run. I mean, Giuliani at the time was not coy about his lack of sensitivity on racial issues, but now with my daughter Naja, we have a blog where we put in images that haven't run in the New Yorker because of that book, Blown Covers, and she put this Harry Bliss image, and it's been all over the news because unfortunately, all over the blogosphere, because unfortunately with the Trayvon Martin case, it actually feels very current. And there's something about the way the artist pick up on the dream of the collective and conscious that's really fascinating to me, that they actually seem to be in touch and catalyze undercurrents that we all go through. So on the left-hand side is an image that Art Spiegelman had done at the time when George Bush was president, and he had Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and as his advisors, and that's Martin Luther King's Having a Nightmare. That's his version of the dream. And This is an image, talk about gathering the collective and conscious, that we published in July of 2008 when Obama was a candidate, and it was denounced by so many readers, saying that all of them, what was interesting to me is that we got tens of thousands. In the day of the internet, you get a lot of instant feedback, but tens of thousands of people said, oh, I understand this image, I get it, I know that it's making fun of all the innuendos about Obama being Muslim and Michelle being unpatriotic, but I'm concerned about somebody else, not understanding it as clearly as I do. And I think, you know, the reason we publish images and provocative images is to provoke a debate and to let artists be at the forefront of a discussion about truths that otherwise could be unspeakable. Like here, there was a lot of innuendos about about Obama being a secret Muslim, and it wasn't just the few Rush Limbaughs and the Fox News and the pundits. That was the first version of that sketch by Barry Blitt with Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter or Sean Hannity, imagining Obama in the White House as a Muslim, but we refined it to just that essence of the image. And Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart on the Daily Show, Jon Stewart did a montage at the time of everything that was on the news, that was all of those unspeakable, again, allegation against Obama. And it wasn't just Fox News, it was ABC and CBS and CNN. I mean, it was all over the place. So it was more accurate to let the artist gather all those thoughts. On the other hand, there are some images that push the envelope in a way that we don't want to. On the left is a sketch by Barry Blitt at the time when George Bush was handing over the keys of the White House to Obama. And it's an image that really felt right, like the wrecked economy, as a wrecked car, as a wrecked economy, until we realized, but wait a minute, if we do this, it could be seen that Obama is actually seen as a parking attendant as opposed to the new president of the United States. So there are issues about representation when cartoonists do those things. Of course, they have to use cliches, but it has to be in the service of what they say. Similarly, on the right is a sketch by Anita Kunz, and at that time it was also when Obama first entered into the White House and having to clean up the Republican elephant's mess. This is an image that was sent to us by Robert Crumb, who had done many covers for The New Yorker, and his ostensible desire was to make fun of those who oppose gay marriage. And certainly all for this, and we've done a number of images that talk about the issues of wanting the legalization of marriage, but we had a problem with this specific representation, which was that it used stereotypes that are very outmoded at this point. So transvestite with hairy legs may be a perfect Art Crumb image, but if you don't know Crumb's work, it does seem to counter what's truly at the desire for gay marriage, which is a kind of normalization of the gay and lesbian relationship. So we decided not to publish it, and that led to a scandal because basically Robert didn't like the fact that we didn't want to say it his way. But Christoph has more to say about evil art directors.
I mean, the way it works really, you sit there, you try to come up with your best possible idea, you scan the news, and then eventually you have this thing, and you show it to your wife, and she loves it. And no, my wife's actually also a very tough editor. But no, I show it to a couple of friends, and ultimately I have something that I think it works, and then I send it over, and for some strange reason, Francoise or other clients don't like it. So there's a lot of this moment. I think ultimately I like to talk about talent, and how really, like, talent doesn't matter. I think the only talent that matters is to kind of like keep on pushing, trying other ideas, or actually arguing. A lot of what I do is argue for the thing. And I really have to say this without cynicism. And I think ultimately it makes the work better. Not only because ideas become sharper if there's a back and forth, but ultimately also you learn to create better art. And a lot of creating art is making your clients trust what you do. And that requires a lot of effort. But to kind of show you the situation, I came up with this chart here. There's me trying to deliver my idea, and the client or the art director giving me their valuable feedback, which looks painful. But on the other hand, if you take the client and the feedback out of the equation, what you end up with is this. And I guess we all agree that this is nothing we want to see, at least not on the cover of the New Yorker. What's especially tough with the New Yorker, of course, is that I have to initiate the process. I contact you in 90% of the cases and say, here, I think this is a story that's worth doing. In my regular work, I get called with this story to say, like, Greek debt, you have 4 by 4 inches, you can't draw feta cheese, whatever, and then or you have to draw feta cheese or something stupid like that. So I know what I have to fight against, which is extremely hard, especially given the deadlines. It's extremely hard. But over the years, I've become kind of comfortable with this setting, a tight set of rules, and then go. When you self-initiate work, you have to really start your problem first. You have to come up with a starting point, and often, as you struggle, you realize that it's the problem that's the problem rather than what you're coming up with, and you're constantly weighing one against the other. So you're doing the sketch on whatever the economy until you realize that actually the economy is completely the wrong story at this point in time. And so there's already a lot of frustration on my end, and that's, I think, also, especially that part is where a good relationship with an art director is. And a very vivid, and we discuss a lot of the art. There's a lot of back and forth from the idea to the hue of blue in the background that I think ultimately really makes a big impact on the work.
I think one of the big advantage, again, for the New Yorker, one of our true privileges is that we don't have to run any image by anybody. We only run something when it's good and it's the right idea. But we're not a news weekly, so we don't have to cover the news of the week. And we're not kept from doing something that's of the moment. So I'm always asking artists, don't edit, don't worry whether it's gonna work or don't go for the finish, just go for the dialogue and enter a chip here, a chip there, and then we can then work it back and forth for finish. The finished picture is the least of our concern. I know if I work with Christoph that it will be a smart idea and it will be beautifully executed, but it's the opposite of what often art students are taught to do, at least in America, where they are taught technique. They send you a portfolio. The portfolio itself has bolts and belts and is beautifully executed, and then you open it and there's nothing in it, But
yeah. No, I find the whole process, as you can see from the chart here, there's very little fun, in a hoity-toity fun way in my life. So there's this one moment when I send a sketch and you say oh yeah, that's something we can go with, but then it goes right back to the tension part where you're trying to not screw it up while you actually draw it. And then of course there's this one little moment of billing, and then eventually really the one point that makes all the tension worth is. And I have to say, this is probably the single best thing of being an illustrator. When on a Monday you go to a newsstand and you see the issue on the newsstand, that's really extremely sexy and fantastic. And only for that, I love being an illustrator.
I think at the New Yorker, again, because of this dialogue with the reader, because this is images that will get responses and letters, we have an incredibly involved readership. That's the reward to the artist, is that their idea will enter into this back and forth with 1 million+ readers that will pay attention to it. In some instances, I'm asked how come I work with artists that are not American. How do I deal with, this is a very accent-heavy presentation between Christoph and I. But how do we deal with the fact that, hey, I'm not American. I don't know that you knew that, but and many of the artists that I deal with are outside the country. I think it gives, well, Christoph has been living here for a long time, but it gives one an outsider's point of view, and sometimes it's a sharper lens through which to look at the foibles of what we go through every day and every week and every year. Certainly for Christoph, it got him to make a very salient point about the American flags, that it's made in China most of the time. And he was one of the first artists to send me a sketch back in 2003 when the Murdoch press was trying to get French fries banned out of the Congress cafeteria. He knew that trend right away. Maybe it's because he's German that he picked up on it. And then this was a cover that we run of Christoph's at the time of tax time. It's a good example of how different the style can be.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's like you have an idea, and as an illustrator, there's always a certain amount of vanity. You want to show people how well you can draw and all that. But I think, like, the New Yorker is still like, it's about journalism. So it's like you want to kind of convey the idea, and often that really means holding back on the drawing. And in this case, at the beginning, I had like much more artful rendering, but we realized as we moved forward that it needed to be very cold and like very kind of like stupid renderings of the warships that had nothing artful about them to really really get the idea across. Or this one was like on the height of the real estate insanity. So it's like the guy in the bar talking to the barman about the studio apartment, and then the doorman dreams of a 1-bedroom, and then so on up to complete craziness of like a 5-bedroom that the person sitting at their shrink is talking about. And I mean, this was great. I mean, this was, I live in Berlin now, but I come back to New York and I read the news constantly. I'm like on Gawker the entire time, and I feel I can enter any New York dinner party and I'm completely on top of all the discussion. But I still feel like for that kind of thing, I need to be here to really kind of like see that like certain things are like kind of like on the mind of people, and these really very local covers are almost my favorites, I guess. I mean, I talked about trust earlier, and like a lot of what we do is fight with editors, and editors are word people, and they, at least they think that words are completely straightforward and clear, and images are always ambiguous to a large degree. And the problem is, I find that images, like even when you think they're 100% clear, if somebody wants to misread them, they can misread them. And I think that's a lot of like the discussions that we have, that we say, people are not that stupid, or sometimes people are stupid. I mean, often it's like really amazing how you think you have this like perfect thing, and then people completely get it the wrong way.
Well, this is a good example. Your, you know, pictogram being interpreted as Scotsmen rather than women, because pictures do function like Rorschach tests. This is in the mind of the readers that you decipher it. This was a sketch proposed a while back, and I thought it was very clever, an image about smart sex in time for graduation. We ended up not publishing it, or maybe doing it inside, which is also another place, because the magazine, again, is a compendium of cartoons as well, so that there's other things than just the cover. But in this instance, this was dependent on having read the words. Otherwise, why would there be condoms wearing little hats on the cover of the New Yorker?
Contraception makes you smart.
And this was an image that incorporated the word, but it was about something that was all around us at the time. In the 90s, there were those Calvin Klein ads that had large close-up of underwear on billboards. I mean, I remember like shielding my children's eyes when we passed certain billboards on Houston Street, or actually they're putting their hands over my eyes because they were embarrassed. So this captured that well, and often actually artists will inspire each other, like when Christoph or another artist does a good image, it gets other artists to go on the same topic. So this was an image by Harry Bliss, who thought it would be funny to have two ladies looking into a shop selling bondage. This is before we moved to Times Square as a building, and before Times Square was renovated. And we didn't run it at the time thinking, well, this doesn't really capture a trend in quite the same way, except I just realized that around the corner from here, they just opened this shop that has all this fancy bondage things. By the way, those bondage leather straps are $1,000, and so the little so sometimes
talk about that Occupy walls.
Yes, exactly. Often artists really capture things ahead of what the word people can put to. And it's true that when we published this image, this was in 1993, when there was the first bombing of the World Trade Center. We did this cover by David Mazzucchelli of a kid wearing a headdress jumping on the two towers, and this was denounced all over the press. Again, this is before the internet, so a lot of the criticism came in the form of news stories and television and tabloids about the fact that we dared use ethnic stereotype. Now, I have this conversation with Christoph and with all the artists that, yes, you have to be careful about the symbols that you use, but cartoonists have to use cliches. Like a businessman always carries a suitcase, and you have to use it in a way that is appropriate. And the intent here of criticizing us simply for having used a headdress, if you do this image with a kid jumping on two sand towers and you don't label in any way the kid, why is he angry? Why is he jumping? Why is he destroying the sand castle? Doesn't make any sense. The image was about Muslim extremists, and it was about extremists of any creed. In this instance, it wouldn't have been readable except with that headdress specifically. I think it's an important thing to be precise in your use of symbols. This was an image at the time when there was a Diet Coke and Mentos craze all over YouTube, and Barry Blitt first tried it in the upper left with two little kids passing on Diet Coke and Mentos to each other, and then he tried it with businessmen, and then ultimately he got the right phrasing for this idea, which was two people dressed in Arab dress, not to try to make a point about all Arabs being terrorists, but simply because that made a point about our own fears. And that is much more relevant. Speaking of our own fears, this was a cartoon sent by Danny Shanahan, one of the great cartoonists for the magazine, at the time when they were female suicide bombers. But it's true that in the age of Mohammed cartoons, one has to be somewhat careful about representation.
I mean, I try to be rather unedited when I send sketches in, but for like the things that I do, there is a lot of series of sketches that I do even before I send things out to an editor. And one of the reasons I started the blog for the Times was that I felt I needed to actually pursue even more dead ends with my work. But when you work in the for editorial, you have like 3 hours. There's no time to really screw things up that deep. So. I knew I wanted to do something on maps, and I started playing around with different ideas. This was Texas and Oklahoma, and I liked it. I thought the idea was cute, but you know, there's all this fantastic work by Steinberg, by Tommy Unger with maps, and I just felt I didn't really add anything to that. I could add my own ideas, but it didn't have to wait to work for a column. I had this one here with Idaho wishes Montana would buy his own newspaper for once, which I really liked, and I tried to kind of come up with like other series, and you know, I looked at the way like Kentucky has a really like wonderful shape of the state, and I tried to see what that does with Virginia and so forth. It didn't really work, so I kind of had to gut that. Ultimately, of course, like, how can you do like a map series without Italy? I had Italy and Middle, and I sent it to like 10 people, and 3 said that they wouldn't get it. So I was like, okay, that's not going to happen. But ultimately, you know, these things then kind of like find their way into the real thing. And ultimately, I realized I wanted to do something with the Google Maps look, because that's how I really look at maps these days. And so the mitten like made its way back here with the Finger Lake and and Mitten Road. And it's probably as existentialist as I ever get in this drawing here.
And in the course of things, we are, Christoph and I, in this constant dialogue, but when there is a landmark event that comes and disrupts, like there was a tsunami last year, every artist that I work with knows that we're going to be looking for an image, and they all try, and they end up sending sketches, and many, this is like just a range of sketches sent by artists last year at the time of the tsunami, and responding to the first event, which was the tidal wave itself, and using all of the symbols and the ways of representing Japan, and including, like, this is sketches by artists from all over, including here using the elements of the Japanese flag, and very often coming up with similar concept, like the one on the upper left is by Bob Stack, which is the world as on the flag, on the Japanese flag. And the piece cut out was by Christoph, and then the red moon over the water was by Zohar Lazar. But one image that Christoph sent was this blossoms, and this is because you were trying to get past responding to the tsunami, right?
It was like that image here before, the one with the earth. I had sent that on I think on the Monday after that weekend, and on the weekend this story broke, and it's a strange moment, because on the one hand, you know, there's nothing greater than working on these stories when they're hot, but in this case, there's just like no fun to be had with a story like that. It was just like people died, you know, people got dislocated. You knew that this was a disaster that would affect Japan for like the next 10, 20 years. And still, but it's like that's where the kind of the journalism part kicks in. So it's exciting. But what I found especially hard about this one was that New Yorker covers, they're always about an opinion. You have your take on politics, on city life, and so forth. I can't have an opinion on an earthquake. It's just terrible. People die and nobody wins, and it's nobody's fault. And so I felt, you know, like the thing with the Japanese flag, with the Hokusai wave, like nothing of that would capture it. And it was really like the time difference that like working from Berlin that made the difference, because in the night from Monday to Tuesday, the whole situation in Fukushima got out of hand, and within 5 hours, the whole story changed from a natural disaster to a man-made disaster, in a sense that the security at Fukushima was just not up to obviously like that disaster that nobody could have foreseen. And all of a sudden I felt like that the nuclear situation was really, this was about human action and something where I could have an opinion on, and where I came up with that image with this kind of like Japanese ink drawing with the flowers just like spreading their poison very quietly. I also felt that the thing that I find so kind of horrifying about that event was it was so quiet. All the images, they were so loud and big, but the sound was always, when the water comes in, there was like no sound. You wanted to hear it, but it was so eerily quiet. And I thought that also with the nuclear poison situation, it was something you wouldn't hear. It's just like coming in there, and that's something I wanted to express with that image.
And actually also, each artist obviously responds in his or her own way. Anna Juan was done some of those sketches and many images, talks about the fact how she welcomes, she both you know, is pained, but also welcomes the assignment of having to try to think on paper, because one of the ways that she responds is that she finds out how it gives her a focal point for her feelings for a natural disaster. And things happen in very fast-paced way. And it's true that like it depends on when the event happens compared to our closing time. But often it's, you know, things born, like here, I was actually using your image, but I was comping it out with a black background that I had used on other images, and I inadvertently, which is 98% of the most interesting creative things I do is by mistake, just ended up with a black background, and that was one way to counter the fact that it was maybe a bit too pretty when when it was first presented.
And so, I mean, what's great about the situation with that Japan cover was the time pressure, because I hate nothing more than having too much time. Even worse is, of course, if your client has too much time on their hands, then they start showing it to all their relatives and come back with crazy suggestions. But so when I do this column for the Times now, I do have a deadline, but there's always too much time to get creatively completely crazy. So I thought of artificial ways to kind of like bring back like the rigid editorial schedule into my life. I went to Venice last year to report on the opening of the biennial, and I like that. And I thought, okay, how can I even top that? So I decided to live draw the New York City Marathon last year. And to make things harder, I wanted to actually tweet it live. So really like only do the drawings while I'm in motion and come up with the ideas, not go in there with any preconceived ideas. So there was the first drawing at 4:48. I tweeted that at 4:52. And then from that on, I did, I think, like 45 drawings. I was in the Staten Island ferry, the people photographing the beautiful sun rising over Brooklyn, and then I drew the people doing the photographs. I thought I would be all worried about the physical aspect, which is kind of scary, but I had the new iPhone, which really, you could see the battery bar kind of like moving down as you kind of just open it up. So I had like 5 extra battery packs. It was like the heaviest thing of my equipment, but it was the only thing I worried about before the race. There's like, you know, people looking at me with a pen and go like, oh, he's writing a book. And then when people saw me on the phone, like especially in Brooklyn, like at the southern part of 4th Avenue, it's like, hey, stop texting. It was, they didn't like that. And then you're like, eventually I got tired, and I tried to show that with a 3-dimensional drawing. I missed the banana stand, which is a terrible thing. When you're running a marathon, don't miss the banana stand. But eventually in the Bronx at mile 20, I was saved. And then in the Central Park, I started hallucinating, and so I didn't go in there with any concepts. The one thing I prepared beforehand is I gave a friend a bag of artist supplies. So because at the end I really wanted to up the ante. Oops, that was. Oh, okay. So that's all. So at the end, I actually got canvas and paint. So the last mile, I was painting my shoe, like a picture of my shoe, and then right before the finish line, I stopped and painted like the colors of the finish line around my shoe. And there's this video when you run the marathon. Now they send you a link of the when you just cross the finish line. I just see myself coming in, stopping, and then there's like. I was at 6 hours, so people don't really run anymore, but they're like hobbling left and right of me, and I'm just sitting there. It was such a mess. Like my backpack, my everything was just like full of paint, but it was worth it.
And last but not least, some recent cover by Christoph, which also shows you the scope of our ongoing discussion, because the first sketch for this he sent back in the summer of 2008, which, had we run it then, was really the cusp moment where the economy started tanking. And then another cover that we ran recently by Christoph at the last Thanksgiving. And the sketch for this is something that he had sent us back in 2006 when George Bush was trying to have a discussion about revising the immigration policy. And again, it's having the right thing at the right time, having artists being very generous with their thinking and also focusing on topics, because at the time when there was a debate about policy, the image probably would have been read to be about immigration, but actually when we ran it for Thanksgiving, it was a much more interesting debate because it was about patriotism and the kind of pious celebration that we can have of an American tradition, and whether it can encompass immigration. So we have one last thing, and then I will actually show and announce the winner of the Eustace Tilley contest. But we wanted to show what's next.
I mean, I'm asked now, Condé Nast is really at the forefront of this, of doing animated covers or like animated illustration, and it's really something different from animation because it has to work in the layout. You can't like have a movie that has a beginning and an end. And so there was a double cover on the World Changers, and so this was when you got the magazine, you saw that, and then when you flipped like the front page around, there was the second image.
It was a double cover.
Yeah, and so for the iPad, we wanted to do an animated version, and I'm like very fortunate to have a brother who like is actually an animator, so he helped me animate that globe, and then so when you got the iPad, you can like spin left and right, and then the background started going by, and there's all sorts of like hidden jokes in the back. There's like the Eiffel Tower, and there's like me and my kids entering the subway, and Big Ben in Shanghai and whatnot.
Okay, and now just in a few slides, every year we do, for the past 5 years, we do a Eustace Tilley contest where our readers send us their images. So this is images take on Eustace Tilley's, and this is the 12 winners of the contest. All knowing that the grand winner would end up being a bag for the Strand where we are tonight. This was, you know, in homage to Occupy Wall Street. This was by 99-year-old Alma, don't quite remember her last name, who is in a retirement home where the art teacher gives the assignment to all the people to do Eustace Tilley. So that was marvelous. Yeah. I hope we can do that well when we're 99. This is there twice. This is another image. And I thought this was very fitting that the 2012 version of the monocle dandy would be a barista. It's perfect understanding. And this old-fashioned take and gentle marking of people who read books is the grand winner that got turned into a bag and will be the next Eustace Tilley book bag.
I also have a very quick thing. I made a poster, and I'm going to give away, I think I have two.
We can turn the lights back on, I think.
I have to find the right way. Or you can, if you have a question, you can, I guess, start with the question while I try. Sorry, this one.
You want me to give you?
Yeah.
Because of the lighting, I decided not to shoot the whole thing.
Okay.
Okay, I guess we can start with the Q&A then first.
Yes, start while I enter.
Any questions? When you were getting started, you had being someone who generates your own ideas for illustrations. Do you feel like there was a strategy that you used for developing that relationship with your art directors?
Of course, yeah, as an illustrator.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was like whether there was a strategy to kind of like bring self-generated content to art directors, or like to get illustrations out there. I mean, as an illustrator, you always think you have the strategy, but my work is fantastic, and everybody will understand it and think it's funny. And I thought that there was something about, you know, when you get the assignment, wait a couple of hours, don't send the things too fast. And I was sitting in for a very good friend of mine, Nicholas Blackman, who at the time was art director of the op-ed page at the New York Times. And he would go on vacation, do you want to fill in for me? And I had never art directed anything really. And so I get in there, and like these couple of weeks that I spent up there were like the best lesson of my life, because I realized when you're an art director, all you're looking for is good work. You don't care where it comes from. You don't know if it's a nice sketch. You don't care if the sketch comes after like 10 seconds or 10 hours. You need to kind of like keep within the deadlines. But ultimately, I find that especially in New York, like most art directors I work with, they're just incredibly curious to see what you got. And they're more afraid of missing a good idea rather than dealing with you or wasting time with something that's not worth it. And that was really, from sitting on the other side, it was my impression really what I got, and really changed, because when you're an artist, you just think, oh my God, if I do the sketch, if I send a cover sheet, then you know they might say it really all totally doesn't matter.
I think that's an excellent answer, because as you just said, like good ideas are few and far between. You look at a lot of pictures, but ideas are very precious.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Christoph, I wondered, do you feel that with
The question was whether the reception to my work is different in Germany than it is here. Strangely enough, I mean, I've always done work for clients there, but I always feel like I get good reception kind of like by detour of New York. So people know the work that I'm doing here, and then that actually gets often like published or republished. It's like slightly, the biggest difference I see there is that if people see something that they like within Germany, they don't want to use the same thing. Whereas here, I know when I have something in the New Yorker or in the Times magazine, next week people will call up and say, like, hey, they had it, now I want it too. And it's like a different attitude. I can't explain it. I don't think it's cultural. I think it's something like, especially from Europe or from Germany to New York, like seeing, oh, it's on the New Yorker, and then that makes it extra desirable.
The question is if I ever have artists whose work I appreciate where I can't find a way to show their work in the New Yorker. Yes, that happens a lot. I mean, there are artists whose work is very dear to me from other years, but are not, because of their content, you know, either interested in bending their own narrative to apply themselves, because it is a form of applied art. And then sometimes I have this other version of the dilemma where I have too many artists whose work I like, and I don't have enough, you know, slots, enough images, enough covers to make sure that everybody is represented. That happens every single week where I have all those images. It just happened like today where I had an image that was ready to go to the printer, but then now I have somebody who's doing something last minute, and then it's like, okay, I'm gonna have to tell him we bumped his image. It happens, you know, to every artist at one point or another. So every time I'm always on the lookout to introduce new artists because it's exciting for them and for me, but I also want to make sure that there's room for George Booth or Jean-Jacques Sampé or people that have had many covers in the past.
I'm just wondering what the response was, if you could speak to striking the balance that the New Yorker has between being kind of like a deep social publication, but then also a lot of political salience. I was interested when you said, I think it was the 1993 cover was maybe one of the first because it was really a political platform. What has it been like to kind of preside over that?
Well, the New Yorker has a long history, and the only common denominator is a tradition of excellence, if I may say so, in the sense that even at the beginning it was a humor magazine under Harold Ross, and that covers the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then after the war it's William Shawn, and it's more of a journalistic excellence. But if you look at the with less emphasis on humor, longer pieces, a lot more journalism. Throughout, there's also fiction and poetry and cartoons. So there's an enormous range of what can be a New Yorker piece, depending on the editors. It's only had like 5 editors in 87 years, so the personality of the editor is very important. And 1993, 1992 in October is Tina Brown was brought over as a young English editor with Don Tatler and then Vanity Fair to rejuvenate the New Yorker. And at that moment, there's more of a return to the humor magazine, to an emphasis on images and an emphasis on artists. But that's another thing that makes the New Yorker stand out now, is that the artists are not just illustrating writers. Sometimes they do. I mean, this happens for Christoph every week, where he actually does the same writer every week that he illustrates. So we do that as well. And we do publish photographers and we do publish cartoonists, but we have artists as full-fledged contributors, and certainly it's most prominently true on the cover. And there's no other large-scale medium that gives that much of a voice to somebody that just has a pen and paper.
This is Aaron. Okay. So the New Yorker is both like a national magazine, but also like very much about living in New York as well. How do you deliberate between doing journalism that's kind of based like within the borders of the city and having a national audience too? Because there's the cover with the Hasidic Jew and the whoever else it was.
The black woman, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the but like the
Crown Heights, yeah.
How do you deliberate?
It actually simply by paying attention to the ideas that the artist will volunteer, because for the most part, the beats that the artists cover is the city. So they either live here, or if they live in Berlin, they know a lot about New York, as we just showed was the case for Christoph. And we assume that it has to be a certain above a certain threshold of recognition. So if it's a local story that gets national news play, Crown Heights was national news at the time. And if we did something on Trayvon Martin, for example, it wouldn't be a Florida story. It's at this point a national story. So there's that threshold that it has to make sense. And in the New Yorker, we have, again, the advantage of having a readership that is very broad and geographically throughout the US, but is interested in what's happening in New York. So that's one of the reasons that they pick up the New Yorker. And there are certain things that we can do. For example, in the summer, it's fine for an artist to do a beautiful villa on the Mediterranean, because as New Yorker, we can go to the Mediterranean, and you can travel in the summer, or you can go skiing in the winter, but you're not going to do a picture of the Sunset Boulevard unless you do it at La Steinberg, where you also put the Guggenheim and the Empire State Building on it.
A friend of mine came up with a pretty amazing conspiracy theory. When they started the cartoon contest, for at least the first 10, 15 times, the winners would always be perfectly spread out through the United States. It was like East Coast, Heartland, like somewhere out west. It was really amazing. And I stopped looking at it, but I think that was the whole reason for the cartoon contest. Not like social media reader interaction, nah. It's just like having names of random American cities in the magazine.
So it's obvious that you're an illustrator is very comfortable using your tool. And you know, a good example is the iPad cover that Francoise has shown. Do you have any plans or desire to develop purely interactive works, whether it be for an app or, you know?
Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time the last couple of months with that. Steve Jobs is a great engineer, but he killed Flash, which for me as an animator and illustrator is terrible. So I actually spent a lot of nights and weekends in the last couple of months learning how to code, and it's not fun. But unfortunately, like right now, it's all owned by engineers, and so I'm really trying to do all this like open parentheses, semicolon, A5, 6 thing, and yeah, so I'm trying to do a lot of that. Yeah. No, but what's really interesting, I mean, that's a great thing with the computer, and also like when we interact, and like Francoise also does a lot of things on the computer. There's something about the immediacy of like, you know, like turning a black background. It's like, oh, what happened now? And so much of design is really immediate decision making, trying something, doing something. And I find the biggest problem with the whole, like everything that's going on the iPad, it's so programming heavy that between kind of creative decision making and seeing the result, there's so much time that goes by that you lose that edge of kind of like being on a roll and realizing that you kind of like there's a story happening, and that's really kind of frustrating. And I'm hoping that, and I guess it's a matter of like 2 or 3 years where we're back to the days where, oh, it doesn't matter, like have like 500 elements just like jump across the page, nobody cares. And I'm hoping for that day, but I'm trying to fight through till then.
Well, as I hope we demonstrated tonight, I think for me the focus is print. And the more there's a flux of images and the more digital iterations there is on my iPhone, my iPad, my Isis, and my iZat, like I want to have one printed issue of the magazine. It's what Christoph was talking about in terms of deadline and permanence. Everything digital is in flux. I mean, whatever you just looked at an hour ago is now superseded by something else. That's a big deal. And if it wasn't for that moment where I'm like sending things to the printer and where the printing presses are rolling, it has a permanence that makes it all worth it. And I think it's a really good discipline. I think at its best, the New Yorker is a filter of like all of this interesting stuff, culturally, intellectually, journalistically. But if we didn't have, and it's great that we have a website and that we have now like a combined iPad edition and subscription and audio this and all of the add-ons, but they add on to a core, and to me the core should remain the printed object. I mean, we are in the right place to make this kind of statement, actually.
Yeah, speaking of, I've just like one last thing. Speaking of old school, I made like a very real old school silkscreen poster of the background, so the white is actually printed on top of the thing. I brought two. I thought of a quick trivia quiz. So, who did the New Yorker cover of the like people in the airplane shoving their stuff up in the overhead? Nice. All right. Fashion cover.
Can
woman.
I get a car?
No, you're out of the competition. Fashion cover of a woman with a bird's nest on their head. I don't know who was first. All right. Everybody else has to go to my website and buy a poster.